in which growing maturity rekindles the relationship between one pair of lovers, and self-absorption carries another pair to the brink of death. Chapter 18. After his conversation with Alexei Alexandrovich, Vronsky went out to the porch of the Karenin's house and stopped, hardly remembering where he was and where he had to go or drive. He felt himself shamed, humiliated, guilty, and deprived of any possibility of washing away his humiliation. He felt himself thrown out of the rut he had been following so proudly and easily till then. All the habits and rules of his life, which had seemed so firm, suddenly turned out to be false and inapplicable. The deceived husband, who till then had seemed a pathetic being, an accidental and somewhat comic hindrance to his happiness, had suddenly been summoned by her and raised to an awesome height, and on that height the husband appeared not wicked, not false, not ludicrous, but kind, simple, and majestic. Vronsky could not but feel it. The roles had been suddenly changed. Vronsky felt Karenin's loftiness and his own abasement, Karenin's rightness and his own wrongness. He felt that the husband had been magnanimous even in his grief, while he had been mean and petty in his deceit. But this realization of his meanness before the man he had unjustly despised made up only a small part of his grief. He felt himself inexpressibly unhappy now, because his passion for Anna, which had been cooling, as it had seemed to him in recent days, now, when he knew he had lost her forever, had become stronger than it had ever been. He had seen the whole of her during her illness, had come to know her soul, and it seemed to him that he had never loved her before then. And now, when he had come to know her, to love her as he ought to have loved her, he had been humiliated before her, and had lost her forever, leaving her with nothing but a disgraceful memory of himself. Most terrible of all had been his ridiculous, shameful position when Alexei Alexandrovich tore his hands from his ashamed face. He stood on the porch of the Karenin's house like a lost man, and did not know what to do. "Shall I call a cab?" asked the porter. "A cab? Yes." Returning home after 3 sleepless nights, Vronsky lay face down on the sofa without undressing, his arms folded and his head resting on them. His head was heavy. Images, memories, and the strangest thoughts followed one another with extreme rapidity and clarity. Now it was the medicine he had poured for the sick woman, overfilling the spoon. Now the midwife's white arms. Now Alexei Alexandrovich's strange position on the floor beside the bed. "Sleep. Forget," he said to himself, with the calm certainty of a healthy man that if he was tired and wanted to sleep, he would fall asleep at once. And indeed at that moment there was confusion in his head, and he began to fall into the abyss of oblivion. The waves of the sea of unconsciousness were already beginning to close over his head, when suddenly, as if a strong electric shock was discharged in him. He gave such a start that his whole body jumped on the springs of the sofa, and, propping himself with his arms, he got to his knees. His eyes were wide open, as if he had never slept. The heaviness of head and sluggishness of limb that he had experienced a moment before suddenly vanished. "You may trample me in the mud," he heard Alexei Alexandrovich's words and saw him before his eyes, and he saw Anna's face with its feverish flush and shining eyes, looking tenderly and lovingly, not at him, but at Alexei Alexandrovich. He saw his own stupid and ridiculous figure, as it seemed to him, when Alexei Alexandrovich drew his hands away from his face. He stretched his legs out again, threw himself on the sofa in the same position, and closed his eyes. "Sleep, sleep," he repeated to himself, but with his eyes closed he saw still more clearly the face of Anna as it had been on that evening, so memorable for him before the race. It is not, and will not be, and she wishes to wipe it from her memory, and I cannot live without it. How can we be reconciled?" he said aloud, and began unconsciously to repeat these words. The repetition of the words held back the emergence of new images and memories, which he felt thronging in his head. But not for long. Again, one after another, the best moments presented themselves with extreme rapidity, and together with them the recent humiliation. "Take your hands away," Anna's voice says. He takes his hands away and senses the ashamed and stupid look on his face. He went on lying there, trying to fall asleep, though he felt that there was not the slightest help, and he went on repeating in a whisper the accidental words of some thought, wishing to hold back the emergence of new images. He listened and heard, repeated in a strange, mad whisper, the words, "unable to value, unable to enjoy, unable to value, unable to enjoy." "What is this? Or am I losing my mind?" he said to himself. "Maybe so. Why else do people lose their minds? Why else do they shoot themselves?" He answered himself, and, opening his eyes, was surprised to see an embroidered pillow by his head, made by Varya, his brother's wife. He touched the pillow's tassel and tried to recall Varya, and when he had seen her last, but to think of something extraneous was painful. "No, I must sleep." He moved the pillow and pressed his head to it, but he had to make an effort to keep his eyes closed. He sat up abruptly. "That is finished for me," he said to himself. "I must think what to do. What's left?" His thought quickly ran through the life apart from his love for Anna. Ambition, Serpukhowskoye, society, court. He could not fix on any of them. That had all been meaningful once. But now nothing remained of it. He got up from the sofa, took off his frock coat, loosened his belt, and, baring his shaggy chest in order to breathe more freely, paced up and down the room. "This is how people lose their minds," he repeated, "and shoot themselves so as not to be ashamed," he added slowly. He went to the door and closed it. Then, with a fixed gaze and tightly clenched teeth, he went to the table, took his revolver, examined it, tuned it to a loaded chamber, and lapsed into thought. For a couple of minutes his head bowed in an expression of mental effort. He stood motionless with the revolver in his hands, and considered. "Of course," he said to himself, as if a logical, continuous, and clear train of thought had brought him to an unquestionable conclusion, In fact, this, of course, that he had found so convincing, was only the consequence of a repetition of exactly the same round of memories and notions that he had already gone through a dozen times within the hour. It was the same memory of happiness lost forever, the same notion of the meaninglessness of everything he saw ahead of him in life, the same consciousness of his humiliation. The sequence of these notions and feelings was also the same. Of course, he repeated, when his thought started for the third time on the same enchanted round of memories and thoughts, and putting the revolver to the left side of his chest, and forcefully jerking his whole hand as if clenching it into a fist, he pulled the trigger. He did not hear the sound of the shot, but a strong blow to his chest knocked him off his feet. He tried to catch hold of the edge of the table, dropped the revolver, staggered, and sat down on the floor, looking around himself in surprise. He did not recognize his room as he looked from below at it. The curved legs of the table, the wastepaper basket, and the tiger-skin rug. The quick, creaking steps of his servant, walking through the drawing-room, brought him to his senses. He made a mental effort and understood that he was on the floor, and, seeing blood on the tiger skin and on his hand, understood that he had tried to shoot himself. Stupid. I missed, he said, groping for the revolver with his hand. The revolver was close by him, but he groped for it further away. Continuing to search, he reached out on the other side and, unable to keep his balance, fell over, bleeding profusely. The elegant servant with side whiskers, who had complained to his acquaintances more than once about the weakness of his nerves, was so frightened when he saw his master lying on the floor that he left him bleeding profusely while he ran for help. An hour later, Varya, his brother's wife, came, and, with the help of 3 doctors whom she had summoned from all sides, and who had arrived at the same time, lay the wounded man in bed and stayed there to look after him. If you enjoy this format, please leave a like and subscribe and return tomorrow for the next chapter.